Welcome back to another episode of the Two Dates and a Dash podcast. I'm your host, Matt Cubbler. On today's episode, I interview Dr. Rick Cromey. He's the author of the book Gentech, and he's a pastor, speaker, author, and cultural historian. Now sit back and relax and enjoy this episode of the Two Dates and a Dash podcast. What is up, podcast land? Welcome to another episode of the Two Dates and a Dash podcast. I'm your host, Matt Cubbler. Before I introduce my special guest, Rick Cromey, who's I did a very, and everybody knows I don't do a whole lot of research on anybody for a specific reason, but for what I did see on the highlights of his website, I'm really interested to have this conversation. But before we talk to Rick, I want to share where we can hear the podcast. If you're an audio podcast listener, really anywhere you subscribe to podcasts, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pandora, wherever it is you listen to podcasts, you can find Two Dates and a Dash. All I ask is that you hit the subscribe button and the automatic download button. That just helps you get the podcast without having to search for it. If you are a visual person like me and you like videos of the podcast, you can go to YouTube. Matt Cubbler is where you can find those. All I ask there is that you subscribe and hit that little automatic notification bell dingy thingy so that you get notified when a new podcast like this one becomes available. What else? Oh, if you want to learn more about me and what I do for a living and what I've done in my career and the mentoring and leadership development stuff and speaking and my book, A Brother's Love, a Memoir, which is right here. The book is the greatest accomplishment of my life. It's my life story with my brother, Andy, who was autistic and had a severe stutter and sadly was killed in a car accident in 1989. And it's just our life story through my eyes and my brother through my eyes. So if anybody wants to pick up a copy of that, I'd appreciate it. It's 16 years old now, coming up. Actually, on the 18th, it'll be 16 years old. And, it's still one of the greatest things that I've ever done in my life. And I'm very proud of that. So you can go to mattcubbler.com or twodatesandadash.com and it takes you to the same place. So I appreciate everybody. All right. Without further ado, Rick, what's up, buddy?
Hey, Matt, good to be on your show and talking to everybody out there in podcast land.
So that was that. So I used to, when I started my podcast, I was doing Facebook Lives. And I would say, "What's up, Facebook land?" And so then I was like, I was missing the metrics component for podcasting because I was getting my metrics on Facebook as far as how many people were viewing the video and all that, but I wasn't getting any of the authentic beginning listener metrics from people listening on audio. So I started doing YouTube type stuff through Zoom. And then had to shift it to, I'm like, well, I like that, but what's up, Facebook land? Well, all right, podcast land. So it just sort of stopped. So you're out in Idaho?
Boise. I live in a little town outside of Boise, Idaho called Star. And it's just a wonderful it's beautiful. In fact, we had a storm come through here yesterday, blew out the inversion. We can actually see the sun and the temperatures are going to rise. It's good times out here in Idaho right now.
I've heard there's not a bad day in Idaho. It's one of those states where I've always dreamt of living.
Yeah.
A friend of mine's daughter is actually a freshman gymnast at Boise State. And so she's been out a few times. I'm a little jealous. Buddy of mine's a police officer in Boise, one of my Army buddies. So I've been to Idaho Falls when my son and I over the summer did before we went to college, a father-son cross country, sleep in the car, kind of no plan kind of trip. And ultimately we're ending up in Montana, Bozeman to go fishing, but we did a bunch of just different stops along the way. And we were in, I guess it was, what's the Wyoming place there where the Grand Tetons?
Oh, the Grand Tetons. Yeah.
Jackson Hole.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. We couldn't find a hotel. So we ended up driving 2 hours to Idaho Falls and stayed in the Les Ritz. We hadn't bathed in a couple of days and had the worst meal of my life at a Friendly's there. No, not a Friendly's, an Applebee's. And yeah. But the drive from there to Idaho Falls was amazing.
Yeah. Eastern Idaho is beautiful. Boise is actually southwest Idaho, so it's a more high desert, and we've got the mountains. In fact, I can see the mountains from my window here, and it's beautiful. But it's not. You go just a little bit to the east, a little bit to the north, you run into those Sawtooth Mountains, the Sun Valley area, which is absolutely gorgeous. And of course, the further east you go, you run in towards the Yellowstone Range, the Teton Range of Idaho. And, that too, I'm from Montana originally. So for me, there's no better place than Montana. I mean, if I have to sell a state, it's Montana. That's my home and always will be. But I need an airport, and for the work that I do, and Boise is the perfect town, and it's got the perfect layout for me to do the work that I do. And I've lived here now, off and on over 25 years. So it's a good place.
But you're still a Midwest mountain guy, which is cool. And I'm actually retiring in 16 months from police work and moving to middle of nowhere, Missouri, on the western side of Missouri near Kansas. I'm on a 30-acre farm there, and I'm going from city kid for 52 years of my life to straight up redneck cow guy. So I'm excited for
Leavenworth. How close to Leavenworth, Lansing you going to be?
Well, I'm 15 miles from the Kansas border. I'm an hour and a half due south of Kansas City and an hour due north of Joplin. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I know that area well. I used to be a professor at a school in St. Louis. So used to drive down to Joplin quite a bit, have a lot of friends in the Joplin area. Yeah. Get ready for some thunderstorms. Yeah. Some thunder boomers, a few of those rotating clouds in that area.
Well, I'm probably the only person that has ever been picked up in a tornado and dropped and lived.
Yeah. I had to say, I can't think of anybody else who's had that adventure.
In suburban Philadelphia, in 1994, my police car, a tornado came through, an F3 came through and picked me up, carried me 2 blocks and dropped me. I was sitting still in my police car thinking I was perfectly fine, and next thing you know, I went for a ride. So yeah, we're building up. I'm mentally prepared for what that looks like out there. So we're building a concrete safe room in the house. So we'll have a place to go if the sirens start blaring. But I'm excited about the next chapter, and I'm excited about our conversation. So you've listened to the podcast. You've heard my opening monologues and how I format the show and how lack of a plan the show actually has. I have one question, and I ask everybody the same question, and I'm going to ask you it because you're no different. Who is Rick Cromey?
Well, that's a great question. Obviously, that is part of that dash, isn't it? That's the whole thing. I think in the end of my life, what I hope, if there's one word that defines me, let's just start with one word, Matt. It would be grace. My life story is about grace, and I grew up in that's a kind of a religious word, and I'm going to connect it to that for a moment because I grew up in a very religious family, very conservative religious family in central Montana. Went to church. I mean, the third person to ever hold me in my life was my preacher. It was my mom, my grandma, and my preacher in that order. And the very next week I was in church, and I grew up in the back pew, one of those hardback pews of a little small church there in little small town Montana. And I loved it. That church family became my family. In fact, later as my family started to fall apart and I needed things, and we can talk about that in a moment, it was my church family that got me there. And all the way through my life, there's been just a slow emergence, if you will, of the understanding of what grace is. We say the word, but to understand it and live it is totally different. And for me, it was about discovering grace. And I'm not sure I fully got it figured out. I'm not sure I'll ever get it figured out, but I'm living closer to grace and a graceful life than I have ever been.
So what is your definition of grace for those that are trying to wrap their head around the concept of grace?
Yeah. Well, classically defined, it's an unconditional state. It's a relationship where there are no conditions. There's no strings attached. There's no, if you will do this, you will get that. There's no incentivizing to the relationship. It's purely built around a love. And in fact, it's interesting. I spent a good portion of my life as a pastor and as a New Testament scholar. I like to point out there are different words for the word love in the Bible, in the New Testament. You have eros love, which, Valentine's Day yesterday was eros love. It's about romantic love. It's sexual love. It's where we get the word erotic. There's storge love, which is family love, between brothers and sisters and moms and dads. It's relational love within a family bloodline, but there's and then there's brotherly love, city of Philadelphia, brotherly love, phileo love. But Jesus actually introduced this new idea. He didn't just introduce grace. He also introduced this idea of agape love, which is unconditional love. In this idea of unconditional love, I think there is surprise and blessing. It's about being, you know that you shouldn't be blessed, and, think of from a religious perspective. And for some of your listeners who've grown up in a religious culture, you know what I'm talking about. There are so many rules. There are so many laws. It can get very legalistic because we want to do things right. And the problem is that we can never be totally right. There's always going to be a way we're going to mess up. And what I love about that word agape as well as grace is that it's the idea that there's blessing there. And it's not just blessing, but surprise. God shows up, people show up, things happen. They're just surprises. So when I look at grace, I look at a word that starts with being unconditional. But secondly, it's pregnant with blessing. It's pregnant with possibility of surprise.
Great answer. So we didn't talk about this. And like I said, we never met, and we had about a 2-minute pre-conversation before I hit record.
This is raw and real, right?
I am a pastor. My stepfather is a pastor.
Okay.
So since I was 10, he's been in my life, and it hasn't always been the greatest relationship. It certainly wasn't when I was younger. Having my biological father who left when I was 1, and just this constant searching for the reason why my dad didn't give a shit. Right. So that was kind of like the underlying notes of my life, trying to solve that complex problem. And this guy who's 12 years younger than my mom, was a rock star drummer, and now he's going to be a pastor, and this whole transitional component of my life at the period of time, it was kind of a tumultuous relationship, and it was for a long time. And it certainly, I grew up in the church. My mom always took us to church. That was one of the big things that our family structure was built on. And then having it become part of our life, literally 24/7, it actually pushed me away from the church.
Yeah.
And still has to this day. My relationship with God has never been stronger. My relationship with Christ has never been stronger. My personal understanding of my salvation works has never been greater. But I've never really been a joiner. And I take it back to, I think I look back on those periods of time as why I can't allow myself to accept that familial, like you talked about, became part of your family. I could never get there. And when I think of grace, I think of it in a very similar way that you do, where it's that for me, I was shown grace at a period of darkness in my life that was exactly the way you defined it. Mm-hmm. And it was one of those moments, those seminal moments where life changes for you. And for those that have never experienced that unconditional love, that knowledge that God has just touched you in a way that is profound and life-changing, I can't even describe the emotional relief that comes from that level of knowledge that God's got you, right? Yeah. So when you, as a pastor, and this is all going somewhere, as a pastor, I'm assuming you have a family, correct?
Oh yeah.
How did you balance the normalcy of childhood upbringing in a typical mother, father, husband, wife, family unit, right, with your pastoral responsibilities?
Well, before we get there, maybe I should tell you my story.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah, because oh man, I'll tell you, about age 12, let me just put it this way. About age 12, my mom was a a stay-at-home mom. My dad was a trucker. So we lived pretty much on the poor end of town. I never had my parents rented a house. Most of my clothing came from yard sales and secondhand shops. And, I was one of those kids that, kind of got fingered very early as being, you're just not going to go well. I mean, your life is just going to be average. And in fact, I had a teacher who looked at me once and said, your last name starts with a C, and that's what you're always going to be, and it was one of those things where I dreamed bigger dreams than that for my life. The problem is that you cannot always dictate, we are control freaks at heart. We want to be in control of every part of our life, and life just happens. This is why you need grace, because life just happens to you. And sometimes you are victimized. Sometimes you are abused. In my case, I was both. My father emotionally and physically abused me with words, with actions, and with discipline. And it was very, very hard. I had a very, very hard relationship with my father. And then my mother at age 12 fell in love with another man, and she was a drunk and she was a drug addict, and she just ran off one day. I came home from junior high. One of the most formative times of your life is moving into junior high. And, the third week of junior high, I come home and she's not there. And I don't even hear from her for 6 months. I mean, she leaves in October. It was like April before we ever heard from her. I was living with my grandparents at that point, trying to figure out my life and trying to figure out what was going on. And I had a younger brother, a younger sister, and a baby sister at the time. So we were all living with the grandparents. And my mom calls, and it was Easter Sunday she called, which is kind of ironic. She calls on Easter Sunday to tell us how much she loves all of us kids. And she's living now in Houston. Now, from Montana to Houston, that's quite a distance. Might as well have been Africa as far as I was concerned. But my brothers and sisters, I got on the phone, talked to her, and then I got on the phone. I was the last one. And I had overheard some of their conversation. Short story, I just put the phone in my ear, and I said, Mom, I've got only a little I want to share with you. First of all, you have wrecked this family. And I want you to know you've wrecked me, and I will hate you to the day I die. Hate you. I don't want to have another conversation with you. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to even know anything about you. You have ruined my life. 12 years old. Okay. And I carried that, just kind of prolonged. I carried that type of bitterness. I carried that hate. I carried that anger all the way through high school. Even though at that point, about 14 years of age, I got baptized in my church, and I started doing all the church stuff, and I became the quintessential church kid, and I was a good kid. On the outside, I was just did everything right, Matt. I was just a good kid, but on inside, I was dying. And, I gravitated towards certain things. I was, I laugh about it now, but back then I was a Kiss. I was into the music of Kiss. And I think the reason was because there was this stuff inside of me. There was this darkness inside of me that I just had. For some reason, their music got me, and I never would have, a lot of their music was stuff that I wouldn't even do. But for me, it was music that I connected with the music. And that didn't, and of course, it upset some of my church friends. They didn't like that. Some of the church leaders didn't like me wearing my Kiss t-shirts to church and all that. But I was just a good kid, but I was very troubled. I went to Bible college just because that's where you learn to be a pastor in my church. You go to a Bible college, and I went to Bible college only because I wanted to please my grandmother. She wanted me to go to Bible college. I said, all right, I'll give you 1 year. I'm going to go. I didn't realize in the context of going for that 1 year that God was going to get a hold of my life and keep me there for 2 years. And I figured as long as I was there 2 years, I might as well stay and go another couple of years and get my bachelor's degree. In the meantime, I got married, and we started off. And I got to tell you, from the day I got married, I realized that something was wrong in my marriage. There was something wrong. I didn't know what it was. Couldn't put my finger on it, but there's just something wrong. And to bring the whole thing into scope, I spent the next 25 years just wrestling with my faith, wrestling with who I was, trying to understand what God was even doing with me. And I was a pastor, I was a youth pastor. And then eventually I became a professor of ministry. I was teaching other people how to be pastors and ministers. I was speaking and writing all over the nation. I was doing all sorts of great things, and people, they look at the resume, they think, oh man, this guy's got it all together. And I was dying on the inside. Absolutely dying on the inside. In 2007, I got my doctorate. I thought that would solve everything. If I just get my doctorate, I'll be I was at the top of my game. I was going nowhere but up in my career. The phone never stopped ringing for me, Matt. And then the Great Recession hit. I lost my job. And I couldn't find a job. I was too educated. I was 45 years old, and in the church, you're put out to pastor at age 40. It's pretty hard to find work unless you've got already a church you're in. And my goodness, it was tough. And I never did find a job. To be honest, I've never worked for the man since then. I could not find work. 2013, I come home one night, and I've been dealing with a pornography problem. I had some relational issues in my marriage, and to be real and raw with you, I thought that pornography was going to solve some of those intimacy issues. And let me tell you, it does not solve those intimacy issues. It just made them bigger. And so I was doing a recovery program through my church called Celebrate Recovery, and I went through the 12 steps, and I was doing all that. And I came home one night, and I'd been like 9 months, perfectly sober. Something I'd never been in my life for as long back as I could remember. And I walked in, and my wife walked out on a Friday night. And I thought she was just gone for the night. And then I thought she was gone just for the weekend. Then I thought she was gone just for the week. And then 60 days later, right before Christmas, I get this divorce decree. And now I'm divorced. Within a few months, I'm divorced. And those were the darkest, hardest, most difficult times, because as a pastor, especially a professor of ministry, I lost every single job. Except for one. I did have one school that hung with me and gave me a little bit of work along the way that managed to feed me and keep me going. But I lost everything. I lost my career. I lost everything that. And that's when I really fell into that dark space and found the light. The light always shines in the darkness, and the darkness will never overcome the light. And that's when I actually experienced grace as I've never experienced it before, which included surprises and blessings. And I was tens of thousands of dollars in debt. And all I'm going to say is today, I sit in a house that I paid for with cash. I am totally debt free. I am married to the most wonderful woman who is my soulmate. Everything that was missing in my 30-year marriage has now been, in the last 7 years, wiped away with the beautiful new memories that I've been creating with Linda. And all I can say is that is grace. And I wouldn't wish my life upon anybody as far as those bad things, being abandoned and being divorced and dealing with the abuse and all that stuff. And I could tell you, there are many, many more stories I could tell you, the rejection that I faced in my life. But I got to tell you, what I wish upon you is the blessing, the grace that I have received. I hope everyone can experience just the way God loves to work with you and for you. And even though you don't see it. So that's kind of a nutshell of my story, and we can go from there, what you think. But the big question you asked about how I pastored, my pastoring, my being a professor and all that eventually blew up my marriage. And it's just tough. It's just
Do you
tough.
have kids?
I do. I have two. My son, in fact, he was here just last night for Valentine's night. We had a meal together and such, and it was good. But my daughter and I, she kind of took my ex-wife's side on some things in the divorce, and I'm just giving her grace now. I'm giving her what she needs. I still bless her. I still love her, but we have very little relationship, and that's hard.
That's super hard. I can only imagine. As a father of a 24 and soon to be 24 and 19-year-old, and being the child of a man who didn't want me, right? So that's I mean, my biological father wasn't mean. He didn't abuse us. He just didn't give a shit.
Yeah.
He just did nothing. He was less than, there were days when I would do stuff to get him, when rare times he would come and get us, that I would try to piss him off just to see something, right? Rather than just, he's here, or pick us up and drop us off at my grandmother's house and then pick us up from there 2 days later and bring us home. Like, that was oftentimes the routine. So
any response was better than no response.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and the reason why I asked that, the original question about the balance, having not known your story, is I think it's, as much as I resented my stepdad for a lot of the where I felt the prioritization was off.
Yeah.
Where God and the church was always first.
Yeah.
No matter what. Always. And to me, that to me was off-putting for me to go to church. Number one. Number two, when your stepdad is also the pastor, it's very difficult to absorb anything that is, as a parishioner, you should gain from your experience within the church. All I heard was me getting yelled at.
Yeah.
Every time he spoke. So it's been and I really am one of the most spiritual Christians that I know, because I have to overly absorb myself into my individual relationship with Christ, because I don't have that fond background of being in the church and those experiences that a lot of kids like you had, where that was part of your life, your family. And to me, it was just a place I was forced to go and participate in, because my dad was the guy in charge, so, and I was just curious.
Well, the irony too with my story is that, I talk about that wonderful church family growing up, but as a pastor, I was hurt horrifically by the church. Once I became a leader in a church and got behind the walls, got back behind the veil, pulled back the steel curtain to see what's actually happening in the inside guts of a church, and that, I was shocked at what I saw. And it was deeply disappointing. And when I tried to call people out on their quote unquote sins of the flesh, whatever they were doing, leadership, whatever was happening, it never ended well for me. And then I move into teaching, and, you asked about my family and balancing things. One of the things that was nice was when I became a professor of ministry, I didn't have to go to the same church every Sunday.
Yeah.
I wasn't, I may have still taught, and because I traveled a little bit more for the school, and my family went with me, we got to see a lot of different churches. And so we were, we did have a home-based church, and our kids were involved as much as they wanted to be involved. And they were pretty involved growing up. And most of their friends were church friends and such, but there wasn't the same type of pressure that you would have as a pastor's kid. Let me also just kind of give an insight here on this idea of balance, because you mentioned that a couple of times. How do you find that balance? I'm going to suggest to you that there's no such thing. That's a myth. A balanced life is a myth. And when you think about someone standing on a high wire, just think about the high wire act. The reason you have the big pole on the high wire act, or they learn to use their arms, is it's because you're balancing yourself. But if you watch, what's going on is they're going back and forth. There's never really a perfect balance. You're either leaning to the left or you're leaning to the right. And at the same time, you're making, you're going. And in fact, it's interesting. If you analyze the whole idea of walking as a human being, when you walk, you're literally balancing yourself. You're putting pressure on one foot, and then you're putting pressure on the other. You're never perfectly balanced. And I think that's one of the greatest myths. Everybody wants a balanced life. What I suggest is pray that you have the strength to make it through the weak times, and that you have gratitude when you have the strong times. Gratitude and a prayer for peace and strength is going to get you through. And and as you attempt to find balancing, not balance. So just a thought there.
That's a great perspective. It is. And if you just think about reality, reality is as we like, you said earlier, we like to control things. The reality is life is uncontrollable. It's manageable there in bites. If you're able to I work, my life is based off triage. Like, everything is, what is the most important thing at this moment that I need to be handling. And I just knock things off the list, because that's the only way I function as a problem solver on a daily basis is to prioritize what is the most damaging or important thing to do at a time. But I do believe what you said is absolutely true. There is really no balanced life. It's simply just finding ways to manage the things that life throws out at you.
Well, control. The whole idea of control, Matt, it's a great word. It's one that we're all control freaks at heart. We all deep down have that. It's a great need for us to be empowered, to have control. But what do you have control over? You don't have control over the circumstances. You don't have control over life itself. The only thing we can control is our mood and our method and our mission. So we can choose to have a better mood. Even though we could be in a bad mood, we could choose a bad mood. We can choose a better mood. And so for me, in my life, what I learned in those dark spaces is I can choose to be better, but if I want to be better, I have to make a better choice. And it's basically a belief that it's a faith that God is working. In my case, I really believe God is always working no matter the circumstance. And I'm underneath this cloud of despair and darkness and destitution and whatever. And I've lived in poverty so deep. I mean, I came this close, so close to being on the street because I had nowhere else to live when I was in that point of poverty. It was tough. And I wondered, where was God? I've given my entire life to you, God. Where are you? And it was in that moment that I heard the still small whisper, I've never left you. I'm still here, and I'm going to surprise you, and I'm going to bless you, but I need you to stay focused on me. And I went, okay, if that's all you're asking is for me to just give you a little attention, you got it. Because he got my attention in that moment. My attention.
Let's talk about that. I think it's really, especially for the people that listen to this show. Everybody goes through shit.
Oh yeah.
Right. So, but how someone shares that journey and how they share the details of it and how they share how they came out of it is usually how others find some sort of hope or bit of information or nugget of knowledge that I'm not alone and that there's someone else has already been down this road and they were able to come through it and this is how they did it. So I'm going to quickly share my moment of grace. So I said in the beginning of the show that my brother died. He was my older brother. He was autistic, severe stutter. We lived in projects all of my youth. Again, being the younger brother there was no autism then. He was considered mentally retarded. It wasn't the thing. But knowing today what autism is, he was severely autistic. Being the brother of the retarded kid who stuttered in the projects is not a good blend. But he was my best friend and I was his protector. And even though I was 2.5 years younger, I was the older brother. So he dies in 1989, a month before I left in the Army in a car accident. And I spent the next 13 years hating God and hating myself and hating everyone, actually. I couldn't experience love. I couldn't experience joy. I could experience accomplishment because I poured myself into the tasks in front of me in order to give myself some level of worth for living. And for 13 years, I suffered in this hamster wheel of negativity and darkness. And I got married the love of my life. Thankfully, she's still with me. Had a daughter who I couldn't love. Didn't know how to give her love. Didn't know how to be a father. I could do the tasks of fathering. I couldn't love her like a father. And it wasn't until my wife was pregnant with my son 13 years later, and he was born, and we named him after my brother. And the day my brother died, he had been staying with my grandmother because my mom and stepdad were on vacation, and I was staying with friends, and he couldn't be on his own completely. So he was staying with her. So for 13 years, for whatever reason, my grandmother kept all his clothes that she had been washing while he was staying with her. And on this day in 2002, it was like in November, my grandmother gave me a gift when everybody came over to the house to see the baby for the first time. He was probably 2 months old, maybe, when this happened. And she hands me a gift. And typically in those types of environments, women are the ones that are involved in the, it's onesies and bibs and whatever. But she had asked me to come in the room, and she hands me this box, and in this box is a quilt. And I'm not a quilt guy. So I folded the quilt back up and I handed it back to her, and I said, "Nan, I don't think this was for me. It's probably for Lauren, my wife." And my grandmother, who was one of the few women I'm afraid of, she looks at me, she goes, "Just look at it." And so I look at it, and then there's some things on there. There's 2 teddy bears in the center, and there's yellows and blues and some like dark blue paisleys. And on the teddy bear is this stitched Andy in gold stitching on brown. And I remembered, all of a sudden it flashed into my head that my brother wore a brown work shirt and the stitching of Andy. So long story short, it was all my brother's clothes. The bandana was the blue paisley. A church shirt he wore for church was the yellow with the little blue stripes in it, and the white were the undershirts he wore underneath his brown work shirt. And she had this made into a quilt. And that was the most excuse me. I was able to touch my brother. So that night, I went down to my office and I cried. And I wrote 26,000 words of memories.
Wow.
In one night. And that became the book. That morning, when I came up, literally all night, I saw, so when the basement door opens up, there's a kitchen window, and the sunlight would come through. And I hadn't seen color in years. And I saw color in the light. It was weird, but it was so bright. And that was when I knew. So I was still a little angry, not gonna lie, but I had left a lot on those pages.
Yeah.
And the color, the being able to see things that were otherwise dark before.
Right.
So when you have that moment, that was 20 years ago, and it still hits me the same way every single time. And that's grace. That's it. That's all it is. That's God. That's grace. That's forgiveness. It's and they say let it go, whatever. It's that moment. But to have that moment, you have to be at, I truly believe you have to be at the bottom. There has to be this place where you just feel, I'm done. I can't go another step. I can't move forward anymore. I can't wake up another day. I can't. And I was there. And I don't know why my grandmother kept us closed for 13 years. Why didn't she give it to me when my daughter was born? Like, why now?
You weren't ready.
She didn't know. Right. And that's it.
You weren't ready.
Exactly.
You weren't ready for it. God was saving that gift for you, Matt.
Yep.
And you weren't ready for it, you know?
So that was my story. And I know you've hinted around your moment of grace and how it changed you and how you went from, the darkest of darkest spots in your life and times in your life when you had lost everything and you were nearly homeless and everyone had abandoned you and deserted you, and the life that you had suffered through. What was your moment?
Well, I'd have to say my moment of grace was Linda coming into my life. We actually met on eHarmony, and it was one of those things we were both getting off of eHarmony. We just, we just weren't finding the right matches. And she was like my last match. And I went, Okay. And 6 months after we were matched like on Thanksgiving weekend. 6 months later, Memorial Day weekend, we were married.
Mm.
And it was that quick. Everything just moved so quickly. And it was a moment of grace. But there's something deeper that I have to share about going back to my mom. If you remember that phone conversation I had, I will hate you to the day I die. Well, the hard part is that as a Christian, especially as a Christian leader, and then a son who professes to be a Christian, you can't just leave somebody at, she wanted back in my life, and she remarried. She actually married the guy she ran off with, and they had a good um, relationship. In fact, as I started to watch the relationship, it was even better than the one my dad and my mom had, my biological dad. And so I began to kind of respect that over time. Time has a way of healing, doesn't it? And as I watched it, but there became a point where I, she kept saying, "I love you, Rick. I love you, Rick. I would love for us to have a relationship." And I said, "You'll never have that relationship. That relationship is gone. You made a choice. I've made a choice. But I'll tell you what, Mom, I will do this." And this was in my 20s. I said, "I'll tell you what, I promise I will take care of you. I will honor you. The Bible tells me to honor my parents. I will do that. But let me tell you right now, you will never hear me say on this side of your life, this side of the dirt, you will never, ever hear me say the words, 'I love you.' I will never give you that gift. And I know that's what you want." And she did. She wanted so badly for me to say, "I love you," because I used to tell her I love you all the time. And that was what crippled me for the next several years. And it really is and then when my own marriage started to fall apart and other things started out, my career collapsed, all that. And I fell into that pornographic moment where I thought that was the answer, because I'm not going to go put something up my nose or drink. Those were not options for me. I never even had a desire. But for me, my drug of choice just happened to be pornography. And it was a brief moment, but it was a moment where, hey, I had to deal with it. And that's why I went into recovery and I started to do that. Well, in the 12-step program, you learn there's this point where you have to make amends with people that have hurt you and who you've hurt. And I realized I was stuck in my recovery. And so on Mother's Day, this would have been 2014, I called my mom on Mother's Day and I said, "Mom, I'm going to give you the gift that you've always wanted. You've been wanting it for a long, long time. And this time I'm going to give it to you." And she said, "What's that?" She'd even forgotten the conversation. I said, "Mom, I love you. And I want you to know that I deeply love you. And I forgive you of what you did when I was 12. And I felt this weight come off of me. You talk about how you feel. I felt the same. I felt like someone literally, I had 10,000 pounds of weight on me, and I just lifted it up and it was gone. Actually, I didn't lift it up. God lifted it up. It was just gone. And I felt free. And my mom and I talked like we had never talked in 25 years. We talked on the phone that day, and it was just an amazing conversation. And, a few months later, Linda and I took Linda, and actually a year later, I took Linda after we got married. We went up there to see her. She was at that time in Great Falls, Montana at a nursing home. She was on her last leg. Literally, she'd lost one leg to diabetes and was just in really tough shape. And my wife got to see her, and it was a wonderful conversation. 6 months after that, she passed away. And the last words that she gave me in this life was, "I love you, Rick." And I said, "I love you, Mom. I love you." I found reconciliation. I found reconciliation with my dad, that abusive dad who never said my name, by the way. I never had a name with him. I was always known as number one to him. I was his first son. I was number one, go get me a beer. I reconciled with him a few years ago, and that relationship, I never heard the words "I love you" or "I'm proud of you," and my dad now says every time, phone call, last words to each other, "I love you, Rick." And I go, "I love you, Dad." I tell you what, that people say you can never reconcile. You can reconcile. If I can reconcile those relationships, you can reconcile any relationship. There are marriages right now that are hanging by a thread, and I believe you can reconcile those marriages if you both focus on the reconciler. The one who can reconcile your relationship is not you. I mean, you're just playing a part. But if you give that relationship over, I believe, to a divine power, a greater power, a higher power than you, and allow that to work, I've seen marriages come back. I've seen friendships that have been separated for years come back to life.
I wish I had the same outcome story that you did with your mom and your dad. Now, when I wrote the book, part of what I felt my mission was with the book, outside of just sharing my brother's life with others, because he was as the different kid, he didn't have friends, he didn't get invited to parties, he didn't have sleepovers. So this is my chance to give him that, so everybody knows him, and he's everybody's friend. He's everybody somebody wishes they could have known. But my dad, I had found out where he lived, and because the last words we had spoken were when I proposed to my wife, and my mother-in-law had put in the newspaper the announcement for the proposal and the engagement, and it said, son of Reverend Paul and Louise Jones. And my stepmother called me and said, how dare you disrespect your father that way, and yada, whatever. And I said, unfortunately, as much as the relationship with my stepdad was tumultuous, he was there every day.
Yeah.
He deserved that recognition. I said, my dad did not. And I said, so that's very clear to me that's not just simply words on a page. That actually, who am I? Who am I the son of? I'm the son of the pastor who raised me, albeit tumultuous. He was the one who raised me. And he was a great husband, loving, tried hard. We didn't always see eye to eye, but he was there. So spoke to my father a little while later on that day, and the last words we ever said was, he said, you're dead to me. And I said, I always have been. And those were the last words I ever said to my father.
Oh my.
And I did write him a letter, and I forgave him. And I said, I don't no longer hold hate in my heart for you.
There you go.
Said,
there you go.
I don't expect anything in return. I don't want anything in return. I said, I just want you to know that I want you to live the rest of your life knowing that I'm okay, and that I forgive you, and I'm going to be just fine. And so I think that release of guilt, and that release of anger, and that release of expectation. So I didn't ever want there to be an expectation from him or me with each other.
Is he still alive?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I would assume so, but
all right. Well, maybe he's listening to this podcast. If he is, it's never too late.
Well,
it's never too late.
If he is, give me a shout, old man. But
I love, but see, you're proving my point is you cannot handle how other people choose their choices, and what they do, that's their choices. But you chose the right way. You said, I forgive you. I'm moving forward in positivity and in peace. And that's the secret. That's the secret.
I wish everyone who is struggling had an opportunity to experience it. And I think, there are a lot of things in my life, when you write a book about your life, it's a lot easier to think about the life that you lived in many different contexts. There are so many moments in my life, especially during those 13 years of darkness, where I missed opportunities of love and grace, that they were there. I just didn't. I was so angry and so stuck in this perpetual, and it was I was doing it to myself almost as a penance as well, because I felt guilty that my brother died and I was his protector, and I allowed it to happen in my mind. I could have just driven to work that day, or whatever the what if I could have worked out in my head to make it all make sense. And I was always worried about living a good life with him being gone, because he was the single greatest, most pure human I've ever known. Like, he wasn't mean. He didn't have anger. He didn't have hate. He was literally just joy in the face of all kinds of hate and evil things that were done to him. He was always joyful. So I had this guilt complex of not wanting to experience anything good because he can't. And so what I learned from all this, in my self-indulged, grandiose belief that I somehow am responsible for everything in the world that happens around me. I realized that my brother lived more of a life in 21 years than anyone could have ever imagined.
Yeah.
He has a book written about him. They built a gymnasium at the camp. He worked at a Christian camp in the summer where he cut grass. They built a gymnasium and named it after him.
Yeah.
He has people who name their children, not just my kid, people that didn't even know existed, tell me that I named my son Andrew after your brother. Like, who has that in 21 years? So what I learned is I suffered for 13 years at my own hand for no reason. And if I would have just took a step back and let God give and allowed myself to grieve, because I couldn't grieve. That's another thing. I went in the army a month after my brother died. There was no grieving. It was right into a mindset. Yeah.
You had to go hump it. Yeah, absolutely.
So
what do you think your brother would say to you today? If he could come into this room right now, into this conversation and have 2 minutes, what do you think he'd say to you?
First of all, it wouldn't be much because he'd be stuttering the whole time. It'd be
well. Let's assume that he's been healed of the stuttering. All right.
He would say thank you.
Yeah.
And I love you, bro.
Yeah, he would. And you know what I think he'd also say is he's proud of you.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Funny story. And it just goes back to the divine. And I do believe that there are angels on earth, and I believe that there are supernatural things that happen that you can't explain. So in this room used to be my son's bedroom, or the bed back here where the sofa is, and it was like an elevated platform bed. And he would lay in bed at night, and he had this frog that you squeeze the hand and would play these nursery rhymes and stuff. And we'd lay there and we'd have to play it 500 times while he's jibber jabbering and talking my ear off, not going to sleep. And we would just talk about whatever. And he's like 5 years old, and he'd heard about his Uncle Andy, and he didn't know anything about his stutter, didn't know anything about his difficulties, just knew that he was in heaven. So we're laying there one night, and he goes, "Dad, why does Uncle Andy talk funny?" I said, "What do you mean, buddy?" He goes, "Well, at nighttime when I'm trying to go to sleep, he sits under bed and he's going, I," and I went, like, my heart dropped. And I said, "Do you talk to Uncle Andy?" He goes, "Yeah, every night. He sleeps under my bed." And I have to say, "Uncle Andy, I'm trying to sleep. Go to sleep." And he goes, "Finally, he'll go to sleep, but not until he says, 'I love you, bro.'"
Wow. Yeah.
And that from a 5-year-old, it's like he was communicating through him. So it's that level of connection that you have with someone who passes.
That's a fascinating story right there. Yeah.
And how would he know that? Like, so, and he was so calm about it. Like, yeah, my dead uncle lives under my bed, right? Like, it was just so matter of fact and so calm and peaceful. And there was no worry. He knew that Uncle Andy wasn't alive. He knew that Uncle Andy was in heaven, but somehow he's living under his bed. So how does that happen? So I just, there's so much to this world and to our relationship with Christ and relationship with God that we don't yet fully comprehend.
Yeah.
And we don't allow ourselves to witness and feel and absorb in real time as it's happening.
Yeah.
Because we are so stuck in this superficial belief that we are somehow in control of the ending.
Well, and I think you throw in in our modern culture where we have we define everything, from a scientific perspective. Science will never be able to wrap its mind around the supernatural because science is about things that you can see, you can hear, you can touch, you can manipulate, you can repeat, and things happen in the supernatural that are unrepeatable, that are undefinable, that are irrepressible, that are unbelievable, and the supernatural defies science. And we live in a culture that wants to define everything by science. And you think about the the response we've had in this last couple of years to COVID. It depends on which science you're listening to as far as what your response was. Well, okay, but there comes a point where it becomes, previous generations, they dealt with these type of things with faith. They said, you know what? I'm going to do the best I can to be well. I'm not going to, if I'm sick, I'm going to stay away from people, but I'm going to trust that God's got my back here and he'll keep me safe.
He's equipped you. That's another thing that there's a biological and psychological equipment package that we're given at birth, right? That hopefully, through the acknowledgement of the church and Christ and the life that he lived and the preachings of the Bible, on top of how do we live our life, that we eat our vegetables and get enough sleep and drink plenty of water, like all those things combined are what God gave us.
Right. To my Christian friends, I always like to remind them that we are not living for this world anyway.
Right.
And it's interesting that in the early centuries of the church, I'm a church historian too. History is one of my favorite areas. And in the early centuries of the church, there was a huge plague in the Roman Empire, a devastating plague, and especially in the cities. And it was the Christians who went into the cities to care for those. I mean, everybody else, when they got sick, they would dump their dead and they'd leave town. And these cities were devastated by this plague, but the Christians went in and cared for the people who couldn't leave. And I thought that's interesting, where everybody else is leaving, and you're a police officer, you know how that works. As a first responder, you sometimes have to go where other people are leaving. That was the Christians in the early centuries. And that was what so impressed people who weren't Christian. They went, how can somebody do that? Well, the reality is, if you are a Christian, you are not living for this world. You live in this world. You love this world. You give totally to this world. You will try to make this world more beautiful, more graceful, more wonderful in everything. If it's nothing more than just giving a smile or a helping hand to somebody. But in the end, you can take everything from my life, Matt, every single thing from my life. And this is what I've learned. You can take everything, but you'll never take God from my heart. You'll never take Christ from my heart. And that is, I live for a future where there will be no more pain, where there'll be no more hurt, where there'll be no more death, where there'll be no more of stuttering, Andes out there, that world is coming and I can't wait.
Me either. I know you got a dog you got to go pick up at the vet. Apparently.
Oh, well, let's see. Yeah.
We're coming up on that hour.
I'll tell you. Yeah.
It went fast, right?
What's that?
That hour went fast.
That does. Well, when you're having a good conversation, let me, there's a metaphor I like to kind of wrap up my story with, because a lot of people do ask, well, how did you, this idea of bitterness and pain, you had it for so many years. And what I learned is I have on my right leg this very long, deep scar. In fact, I'm looking at it right now, very long, deep scar. And it happened when I was like 8 years old. I was running the bases, playing backyard baseball, and I slid into second base, and it was a bottom of a pop bottle that was cut off. And I just slid across that. It was in the dirt, and I didn't know it was there, and it cut me up fierce. I should have had stitches, but we were so poor I couldn't afford stitches. We just did a butterfly type of thing with bandages back at the house. But for months, that thing would bleed, it would seep, it was terrible. But every day it got a little bit better. And then one day it stopped hurting. And then several days, several months, several years, it just became the scar. And to me, that's our problem. Too many of us, you talk about when should we share our stories? I think you share your story when it's truly a scar. And it's a scar because there's no more pain left. There's only a story. A scar is nothing more than a healed story, and it's not painful anymore. It doesn't hurt you. It doesn't debilitate you. It doesn't disable you, but if you're living in your pain, and many people still are, you're not ready yet to tell your story. You're not ready yet. And it took me 40 years to be able to tell my story. I told parts of my story, but not the whole story. And I can tell it now. I've been free. I'm sober. I'm free from pornography, I'm free. I'm free from bitterness. I'm free from anger. I'm free from those things. And it's a blessing to be on your show. And to be honest with you, we do have 2 dates. We have a birth date and a death date. And that dash for me in between, I hope it's just nothing but grace the whole way.
Amen to that, brother. Tell everybody where they can find information about you. Get your book, Gen Tech. What's the best place to find you?
Yeah, just rickcromey.com is probably the starting spot. I do have a nonprofit work that I do, that faith-based nonprofit that I run. I have all sorts of different things through that, of course. And I do training. I do leadership training and educator training and parent training and such. But rickcromey.com is probably the best place to start to get a picture of what I do.
Awesome. And I'll put the links to the book, to the websites, everything in the show notes. So anybody who is looking to get in contact you, they know how to do that. So I appreciate you. Hang tight. I'm going to close out the show. We'll talk offline. Everybody, thank you for watching and listening to this episode of the 2 Dates in the Dash podcast. Thank you to Rick Cromey for sharing his journey through life and his testimony with God and all the things that grace has bestowed upon him. I pray that each and every one of you has an opportunity to experience grace. I know firsthand how powerful it is. And I truly do like to use this platform to help people see things in a different perspective, whether it's politically, whether it's relationship wise, whatever the topic is of the podcast. I hope it inspires you to see something differently from a different vantage point or from a different angle. And I hope that this podcast gave you the opportunity to see the benefit of grace and what allowing God into your life can do for you, even in the moments where you believe you've been abandoned. So thank you, everybody. God bless, and go out, be kind to one another.
Two boys in a sandbox, like brothers we became. From matchbox cars to playground scars.